So now we're going to move on to a story that's come out of the British Museum, and that is the news that a trustee has resigned over the sponsorship of an exhibition or a gallery. I suppose it doesn't really matter. The sponsorship of a portion of the museum, probably an exhibition, and also issues surrounding repatriation. Although one wonders, or certainly I wonder in that sense, whether this issue of repatriation has been conveniently tagged onto this resignation, because it's a
Yeah.
background concern that's handy to highlight at this point. What's your take on the resignation of is it Adaf Soif?
That's right, and perhaps we probably just ought to fill in a little bit of the background to this.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Adaf Sueif is a novelist.
Mm-hmm.
I think she's Egyptian by background.
Yep.
Um, and she resigned as a trustee of the British Museum recently, and wrote in the London Review of Books, my resignation was not in protest at a single issue. It was a cumulative response to the museum's immovability on issues of critical concern to the people who should be its core constituency, the young and the less privileged. And then she went on, the British Museum is not a good thing in and of itself. It is good only to the extent that its influence in the world is for good. And she said, will the museum use its influence use it to influence the future of the planet and its peoples, or will it continue to project the power of colonial gain and corporate indemnity? This is tied up, for example, with the sponsorship of events and exhibitions at the museum by the oil giant BP.
Mm-hmm.
Now, BP have also they've been very active in sponsoring the arts, and there have been similar very visible protests when BP have sponsored things at, for example, the Tate Gallery. There was a protest at the Tate Modern a while back when protesters sort of poured oil over the foyer, if I remember correctly. Basically, this is to do with a number of different issues. There've also been resignations from high profile actors, artists, over things like sponsorship by big pharma companies.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's the ethics of sponsorship, the ethics of the companies who try to, some people would argue, greenwash their public image by sponsoring, good things like art exhibitions and historic galleries.
And it's not like BP needs to. It has an image problem. I mean, what if they do?
Exactly.
They have a problem.
Exactly, and I think this is it's tied in with the new much higher profile in public discussion of what's now being called the climate change emergency. I think quite rightly. And there was a story this morning that I think it's the UK Met Office had been crunching data, and Britain's hottest days recorded had all been since the year 2000.
2002.
2002. Sorry, beg your pardon.
The year 2002.
Yeah.
The Britain's hottest winter day was this February, and Britain's hottest ever recorded day was last
2 days ago.
Yeah,
3 or 4 days ago. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, like into last week.
So exactly. So there is that trend there. Although incidentally, I need to talk to you after we finish recording about a certain email list that we're both on. It's a curious, yeah. So, but anyway, I won't talk about that here. But also,
you realise you've just intrigued our viewer now, don't you?
I know. Well, this is one of the tricks, you see. You keep them enticed, you treat them mean, keep them keen. But also, actually, just going back to the story, it's interesting here that this sort of connects to what we were talking about in terms of the some of the things to keep an eye on. So the Lincoln Museum and archive problem, because there's a quote here from Sir Richard Lambert that BP's sponsorship has actually allowed the museum to made it possible, sorry, for the museum to put on exhibitions and programming that 4 million people have seen. And it's one of those things where society, as it were, can't have it both ways. We can't underfund this stuff and have politically and economically neutral institutions, if you so to
Yeah.
So someone's going to fill that gap, and BP are more than happy to do that. So on the one hand, I can see why if British Petroleum came to me and said, "Here's £4 million, put on exhibitions, look after your archive to reinvigorate storage and care of materials, so and so forth. Just make sure that our logo is at the beginning of every gallery." I think I would be tempted to do that. And so again, I think this must come down to funding. It comes down to the public funding of these institutions. And unfortunately, and this is why I asked this question at the beginning about whether or not actually the repatriation issue is a tag on. Unfortunately, I think these things are actually they're not connected, but they are cumulative. So if you are an institution that is not returning, for example, the Parthenon marbles, and you're accepting money from an oil company that flooded a huge portion of the American coastline with oil not that long ago, then that's going to reflect badly on you as the British Museum, if that's what I mean. And so to what extent do you think it's convenient to mention repatriation at this juncture as she is resigning? I mean, do you think this is a reason to resign, or do you think it's more of a reason to stay on and keep on pushing at it as a trustee, as it were?
Everybody. These in the end are issues of individual conscience. I think what I would say is that nothing in the sponsorship of an arts event or a cultural event by any sponsor prevents discussion of that sponsor. And there's one argument. If BP supplies oil to a generator that runs a mobile, I don't know, breast screening unit or something like that, should that unit not work because it's got BP oil in the generator? At the moment, fossil fuels are a fact of life. They're also a major area of public discussion because of the perceived climate change emergency. And when I say perceived, I'm not saying that I'm a climate change skeptic. I'm not. It's simply the way we couch this discussion changes from day to day almost.
The
framing of the issue. Framing of the issue, exactly. And various people have at the moment. BP is a bête noire at the moment. With the National Portrait Gallery has been in trouble because, and the Royal Shakespeare Company, two of our major cultural institutions have both been under attack for taking BP money. But as you say, they would not be able to do a good deal of the work that they do without commercial sponsors, whoever they are.
No. Well, and therefore, actually, it's also worthwhile. I think I made this point just before. I think it's worthwhile just clarifying. The oil itself, as it were, is morally neutral. The act of using it, you could argue, has implications. But the liquid, as you say, it's not evil. So it can do good. It can do ill.
Yeah.
The question at hand really is what it means to accept that money and what you're getting in return for that money as BP, for example, and whether or not actually in accepting that money you're able to to make the case to BP, for example, face to face about climate change and so on and so forth. So it's an interesting balancing act.
Yeah, I think there's an underlying issue here as well from the point of view of the museum and cultural managers. And it's alluded to in Adaf Soef's resignation. Again, she talks about the British Museum's, quote, immovability on critical issues. In other words, that as she perceived it, the trustees and the senior managers at the museum weren't responding to that particular strand of public opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we're into management theory. These organisations aren't democracies. They
No.
don't do a national plebiscite every time they just they see that policy is delegated to them to run as they think appropriate and fit for the best in the best interest of the institution and their remit and the legal and the acts of parliament that constituted the British Museum, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So these are complex issues, and in fact. There's a very interesting comment that was made. I mean, we've alluded to it before, I think, as well. When we've discussed things like the Roads Must Fall campaign and things like that, it's dangerous to take a far-reaching position
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
on what might be a relatively ephemeral political stance made by people who are generating a lot of noise, but might not be as representative as they like to set themselves out as being. Now, I'm not saying that to criticise any of the people that are involved in this.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm saying is that these are really complex issues, often with legal ramifications, and very profound cultural ramifications, and if a haste to rush to judgment, a simplistic judgment, might in the end be found to be counterproductive.
Yeah. I mean, have you ever played Dungeons and Dragons?
No.
Okay. Well, I'm about to make a D&D reference.
It's okay. You're allowed to.
In Dungeons and Dragons, there is a god called, let me think, Torm. I think Torm. And Torm, many of the gods in D&D, they're based on various real-world deities from across the globe. Torm, I'm not quite sure exactly where he comes from, but Torm is a god who is often criticised as being inactive. He is a watcher, and his interest is the long-term balance of the universe. And sometimes he will act decisively, and sometimes that's seen as being cruel or unthinking. So in D&D lore, Torm murdered another god at one point because he knew that this would lead to a certain sequence of events that blah 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 blah. But this idea of being slightly removed from the fashions and foibles of reality is something that characterises that god, and to a certain extent, I can see the argument made for institutions like the British Museum to be like that, to be a little to be a bit behind the curve, just to see where the curve is going.
Take the long view.
Take the long view, but also there's another really crucial element here, and hopefully our one viewer at home appreciated that D&D reference.
Well, presuming I do know actually our viewer does love playing Dungeons and Dragons.
Oh, wonderful! Yeah, well, yeah, excellent. Did they say
doesn't do much? Haven't got much else of a life, but they no, I didn't say that.
Come on, D&D can be enjoyed by my lovely wife loves D&D even.
Absolutely no, nothing. There is absolutely nothing.
She's very well rounded.
I'm just making smart ass comments for the hell of
it. Nerd. But our one viewer hopefully enjoyed that. But the point is here. Not only is there a good argument for being slightly behind the curve, but also there's a very real prescient issue, and that is, and I've mentioned this before, and that is that the British Museum can say what it likes. It's governed by by Parliament. It's governed. There are laws that bind what's in the museum to the museum, and even if the British Museum wanted to, and I'm sure there are people on the staff who want to see certain things returned to certain countries, they can't until Parliament says that they can. They can lobby for it. They can recommend it. They can request it even. They can build up relationships where they loan out material, but they cannot simply return it. This is an issue of law, and just taking the lid off the jar, just for a second here, off the Brexit swear jar. With Johnson's new, and they said regime, administration. With this administration, I can't imagine.
Yet to see what they can administer their way out of a paper bag, but we'll see. Let alone the EU, but we'll see.
But the rhetoric is is not one which is conducive to giving material away from the British Museum. Shall we say?
No, I think the opposite actually would be the
Exactly. It is very reminiscent of some of the worst habits of Britishness over the past couple of hundred years. So, I can't.
Well, I mean, let's be absolutely plain. A lot of the criticism of Boris Johnson's apparent worldview is that it is not even a British exceptionalism; it's an English exceptionalism.
Yeah.
And harking back to a past that sort of never existed. That there's a particular MP called Mark Francois, who's the deputy chair of the European Research Group, who can't seem to make a public statement without alluding to World War II and how we stood up against the Germans.
Yeah. Or calling people from Belgium Germans.
When somebody like that is, a senior member of the governing party of the country, and
you cannot see them returning materials to other nations. Is my point? No. And so I find this act of resignation to be interesting, but possibly ever so slightly impotent. In so much as I'd much rather see someone like that continuing to be a trustee and keep on working on it. The problem is, though, is that I didn't know she was a trustee until she resigned. That's also an issue here.
Yeah.
It's hard to make the case loudly and publicly unless you do something like this and actually stand up for one's principles. And so I can see it from both sides. But ultimately, for people who do criticise the British Museum, and I often see this, for example, on social media, it's not down to the people in the building. It's down to the people up the road in Westminster and the laws that surround the collection of the British Museum, the national collection of the British Museum. Yeah.
I mean, I just make one point just to finish in a serious point. Now, we joked a fair bit in this as well, but again, traditionally these internationally important repositories, which is what these are. It's the old Enlightenment view of a museum or a gallery as being a world resource, as being something to be shared as a. It almost sits outside. It sits outside of normal discourse as this magical place that it shows the best of us. Traditionally, they are governed by what are usually termed in Britain anyway the great and the good.
Yeah.
It's ex-politicians, aristocracy, people who've done well in the city.
I think you say Aristotle then.
Some might wish, some classicists might wish.
Yeah.
But no, in all seriousness, and they've, until relatively recently, things like transparency and accountability haven't been on the agenda for them.
No.
And increasingly, I think that's being found as unacceptable, including by, the younger generations of professionals, some of the younger generation of professionals coming through in the archaeology and heritage sector, who are demanding different standards to what their predecessors would have demanded 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago.
Yeah. So, as ever, I'm sure we will return to the British Museum at some point.
This is going to be a long-term discussion. It's going to develop over years. There aren't any quick fixes here, I think.
No, exactly.